as the Prime Minister is going to be making his way now to Ukraine in a special train, a bulletproof train. I want us to rewind to July 8th, on that bright blue sky day in Moscow, and you can see those pictures in the center of your screen. Prime Minister Modi landed to meet with Russian President Putin. Within minutes, photos of President Putin enveloping his, quote, dearest friend, unquote, Prime Minister Modi went viral. The optics couldn't have been more jarring. Barely hours earlier, a Russian bombing raid had killed at least 41 people in Ukraine, including at a children's hospital in capital Kiev. The West was outraged at this, quote, depraved war crime, unquote. President Putin may have been, quote, delighted to see, unquote, Prime Minister Modi, but leaders of the West from Warsaw to Washington were seeing red. The US expressed concern and urged Prime Minister Modi to emphasize Ukraine's territorial integrity during his talks in Moscow with Putin. The Biden regime's envoy to Delhi even warning India that it should take, quote, its friends for granted, unquote. Embattled Ukraine's beleaguered President Volodymyr Zelensky was positively apoplectic and spat out his disapproval on X, describing the meeting as, quote, a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow on such a day, unquote. Now, barely 6 weeks after his very public moral excoriation of Prime Minister Modi, Ukraine's conscientious chief executive officer is rolling out the red carpet to welcome the leader of the world's largest democracy. Zelensky's change of heart is a stunning example of moral elasticity, but instead of being shamed for his opportunism, the Ukrainian president must be admired for remembering that in the shape-shifting landscape of global diplomacy, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. President Zelensky knows the value of Prime Minister Modi's considerable utility as a bridge to President Putin. Now, viewers, if Zelensky doesn't mind who Prime Minister Modi supped with before him, then why should his other Western cohorts have a problem? Why must they urge India to pick a side? Why must they morally blackmail New Delhi into believing that it is under an obligation to, quote, get off the fence, unquote, and condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine? When did the West intercede on India's behalf? And beyond India, when did the West show moral resoluteness to resolve conflicts in the global South? Viewers, I ask you that question. China's expansionism in its sphere of influence is at par with Russia's neo-imperial acquisitiveness in Eastern Europe. China has routinely trespassed in both the subcontinent and South China Sea. Yet its flagrant violations of international law, both on land and at sea, have never moved the West to impose crippling economic sanctions. Why, one wonders, viewers? Why, one wonders? Let's ask this question. Let's ask this question of some of our experts tonight who join us in the backdrop of this impending meeting. And I want to begin first with Brahma Chileni. Mr. Chileni, we have been given earfuls by the West on not siding with the West in criticizing Putin. I have given you examples of when the West has gone MIA, missing in action, so to speak, not standing by the global South. Should we be today dancing to the Western tune? Should we be morally obligated to burn our bridges with Putin in our pursuit of some sort of, I don't know what, interest with Mr. Zelensky? Simple question to you.
Rahul, just take a couple of concrete examples. India has been locked in a military standoff with China for more than 4 years. War clouds have appeared over the Himalayas. Has the US taken sides in that border conflict? Biden hasn't even uttered a single word on this confrontation. Or take Pakistan's cross-border terrorism, which is an issue not just for India, but for its other neighbors, including Uzbekistan and Iran. Is the US taking sides there? Or actually playing both sides? The thing is this, the US values its strategic autonomy. Even in India's neighborhood, It pursues policies that are contrary to India's vital interests. Take Myanmar, take Bangladesh. American policies are antithetical to India's core interests. And yet, it tried to bully India in 2022 to take sides in the Ukraine conflict. India has no dog in that fight. And India correctly took an independent, neutral stance. And it's not just India. Every non-Western democracy, name any non-Western democracy, every non-Western democracy has taken a neutral stance in the Ukraine conflict. So India is not the loner. India is very much the voice of the global South.
Let me bring in Peter Kuznick, who's a history professor. Mr. Kuznick, there is this expectation in the West, in capitals between Warsaw, Brussels, and Washington, that India must today, when decide which side of the fence it must stand on. Is this unrealistic? Duplicitous?
It's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. The West is going to be disappointed. India is not going to play that game. India has tried to remain neutral. India sees that this invasion was not justified, but it also sees that it was highly provoked by the West, by NATO expansion, by NATO policy. And so Modi has not taken sides, and the West has criticized him for that. But they're especially sensitive about the fact that he visited Moscow last month while the NATO summit was taking place in Washington, D.C. That was especially irksome to the West. And so now, and he was criticized heavily by Zelensky for embracing Putin while this was going on. So now he's trying to make amends, but he is not going to play the U.S. game. As our previous speaker said, the global South as a whole is refusing to play this. And that's partly because they have to understand the history of colonialism. They understand the history of imperialism. They understand the attempt to establish hegemony by the United States. And so they are playing, he's taking a very, very different position. And I think he's going to stick to that.
Okay, that's an important point. You're almost suggesting that Modi is doing a balancing act for the optics, so wrong optics, when he landed up meeting Putin, when there was an important meeting going on amongst the allies who were depending on, or sort of trying to survive Ukraine. Ramachandani, is it a balancing act? See, I don't see it as a balancing act, quite frankly, but do you?
Well, India is always trying to play the role of a balancer between rival blocs. But here, I think it's very important to remember that he met with Zelensky. They beer hugged each other. They held formal bilateral talks just 2 months ago on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. Now that the West has forgotten. That before he beer hugged Putin in Moscow, he beer hugged Zelensky. And in that 2-month period, since then, what has changed? Have gone from being bleak to becoming almost zero now. Ukraine's incursion to Russian territory, attack aimed at Moscow, have killed any prospect for a ceasefire. The issue, though, is, given the fact that the prospects for a ceasefire are almost zero, why did Modi choose to go to Kyiv? This could have waited until there was an opportunity for India to play a meaningful role as a go-between Moscow and Washington, or even be a mediator. But right now, given the fact that the U.S. is now in the midst of a presidential election, and only that election will clarify American policy, it would have been better had he gone later in November or December to Kyiv, because you don't make a prime ministerial trip to a country without seeking to achieve something substantive. At this time, being followed, it's what Modi will bring back home, or how he could ease the conflict in Ukraine.
Well, let me tell you, viewers, that Prime Minister Modi used a couple of phrases even when he was conversing with Mr. Putin. He said, "This is not an era of war, but it's a time of dialogue and diplomacy," unquote. If anything, it is the West that is obliged to heed his wise counsel and end a war that it has self-indulgently foisted upon the rest of humanity. Would you agree with me, Professor Kuznick?
Yes, I agree with you. I agree with Prime Minister Modi. This is not, in the nuclear age, war really cannot be tolerated. We see the threats now going on to the Zaporizhia and the Kursk nuclear facilities.
It's true.
We see the possibility, the threats of nuclear retaliation. Zelensky says, "Give me permission to use all the weapons you've given me to attack anywhere inside Russia that I feel necessary." And we know that. He also says, "Don't worry about Russia's red lines." Well, many of us in the West are very worried about Russia's red lines, about the possible use of nuclear weapons in this war. And that's a possibility that exists in all wars between nuclear powers or proxy wars involving nuclear powers.
Yeah.
And so Ukraine's aggressive approach, their invasion of Kursk, and targeting of some of Russia's early advanced warning satellite systems, their nuclear warning systems, has really sent shivers down our spines.
So viewers,
we need diplomacy. We absolutely need diplomacy. Diplomacy has become
maybe Mr. Modi is the man. Now we'll have to wait till tomorrow to find out what the outcomes are. Tomorrow at this very time, we'll have Brahma Cheleni back. We'll have other experts back to analyze what really went on. But viewers, you must ask yourself, the West is lecturing India, but who, viewers, is tempting fate by basically saber-rattling and calling for a war to the finish? That's the question. And should we be going in there and cleaning up the muck? Think about that, viewers. I leave it at this.